Now you've heard of React and you've heard of Python, but what about ReactPy? This is a library for building user interfaces in Python without writing any JavaScript, and these interfaces are made from components that look and behave similarly to those in React.js. Now as it says here, it can be used by those who don't have web development experience, but it's also powerful enough to grow with your ambition. Some bold statements here. And we're going to dive into ReactPy in this video, and you can imagine something like this being useful for people like data scientists, data engineers, people who don't necessarily have that web development background. So let's have a look in this video. Now before we get started, we've opened up memberships on the channel. If you're enjoying this content, it would be amazing if you'd become a member of the channel. And if you want to support the channel, we have a Ko-fi page as well. And don't forget to like and subscribe. So let's get started. Now ReactPy is another one of these libraries that is for building user interfaces essentially in Python. And some other ones include Reflex. So again, front and back end in pure Python, and you can see some code here. If you're interested in a video on that, let me know. We also did a video on Flet, and this allows you to build these multi-platform apps in Python, and it's powered under the hood by Flutter. And I'll leave a link to that video just below. And another one that I'm going to do a video on very soon is this one here. It's called 𝗵𝗽, I think that's how it's pronounced. And you have other tools such as Streamlit as well. Now this video is about ReactPy, but if you want some more videos on all of these, let me know. So let's get started and have a look at some code here. So what we can do here is we can import some stuff from ReactPy, and we can define an application component, and that can return some HTML. So we're using html.h1 to return a header, and then we run the application and we can see what happens. Now what I want to do essentially is just copy this and see how it looks, and then we'll build a more complex example. And if we go to the Getting Started section, let's see how to install ReactPy to begin with. So we can copy this command here, and this will install ReactPy along with a Starlet backend. Now there are different backends you can use. For example, FastAPI and Flask are supported along with some others. Starlet is probably the most lightweight one. So we're going to install it with that command. So let's go to VS Code, and on the terminal I have a Python virtual environment, and I'm going to install ReactPy with Starlet. Now once that's done, we have this empty main.py file. I'm going to go back to the documentation, and let's copy the code that we saw here, and we can paste that in here, and we're going to see how to run this. Now one thing I didn't notice was this component decorator. Now when you define these functional components, they typically represent a piece of the user interface, and you can decorate the Python function with @component. And then if we go to the terminal, notice that we're passing the app, which is the root component, into this run method. So I'm going to run python main.py, and we're going to see what happens. Now when we run this, we get some stuff starting up at the bottom, and notice we're using 𝗬𝗍 as our web server. And there's an application now running on localhost 8000. So what I'm going to do is open the browser. And when we navigate to the page, we can see hello world is output here in a header 1 tag. So this page in all its glory is what we have built here using this single component. And this is the root component, but like React applications, we're going to see that we can nest components and build a hierarchy of these components. And we can also use things like state and hooks and event handlers to handle events and build up a nice interactive application. Now we're going to build something highly original here. It's going to be a to-do app. So we're going to have another component here, and it's going to be called to-do. And I'm actually going to pass some data into this component. We're going to pass the name of the to-do. It's going to be a very simple to-do for now, just containing a name. And we're going to return a paragraph tag. So we're going to use that HTML module that we imported at the top, and that's got that paragraph tag here, .p. And let's pass in for the text the name that's been passed into the to-do component. So this is similar to props in a normal React application. It's passed in, and we can then access it and use it within the component. Now inside the app component here, we're going to nest a bunch of to-dos. So I'm going to remove this code here, and we're going to return an html.div as the root component. And into that div, we're going to add some child components. So let's start with a header 1 tag. We're just going to say ReactPy is cool. And then we can add a to-do, which is a nested component here, and we're going to pass a name into that. So let's say learn Python. And I'm going to add another couple of to-dos here. So let's say learn SQL is another one. And finally, let's say brush teeth. So we've added 3 to-dos here, and hopefully that's not the order of these operations. And they are referencing this nested component here, and that's how you build up these hierarchies. Now I'm going to stop the server at the bottom, and let's clear the terminal. And let's rerun python main.py, and we can see the changes in effect. And when we go back to the browser, we have the header, and we now have the 3 to-dos displayed on the user interface. So what else can we do here? Let's go back to VS Code, and we can pass styles to the elements. So for example, if we define a dictionary of styles here, for the paragraph, let's say the font size is going to be something like I don't know, 32 pixels, and let's give it a color of red. And we can pass the styles into the paragraph. So what we do in order to do that is we pass some options as the first parameter to the element. So I'm going to set a key here called style, and we can set that equal to the styles dictionary that we have above. And let's save this and go back to the page and see what has happened. And we can now see the font size of each to-do is larger, and it's also got the color of red. So that's how we can apply some styles here. And we can make some of this dynamic as well. For example, we could pass the color in as an argument, and we can give that a default here, let's say of red. So again, similar to props in React, if you want to customize how a component will appear on the user interface, you can pass in these props, and you can also define defaults. And what that means in the root app component here is that we can pass a color in if we want to change that. So for example, for 𝗠𝗏, we could set that to blue instead of the default of red. And of course, what we also need to do is change the value here for the color and set it to whatever the parameter is. Once we do that, we can go back to the user interface, and now we can see that 𝗠𝗏 has the blue color. So that's how we can start customizing these components. We can define the props that we want to pass in, basically as parameters to the component, and that will then allow us to customize the way the component appears in the user interface. Now, of course, in a real application, you wouldn't want to hard code to-dos like this. So what I'm going to do is just simulate some database data here. Let's say we have this simple list of to-dos, and inside our app component, what we can do instead of rendering these one at a time is we can actually define a list comprehension in Python. So I'm going to do that just now. Let's get a list comprehension on the go. And for each to-do in that list, we will create the to-do component, and we're going to pass in the name of that to-do, and that's for each to-do in the list that we defined above. Now, if we save that and go back to the user interface, you can see we still get these rendered here. So if you have some kind of state, for example, from a database, and you want to pass that data into components and render a group of children, you can easily do so using a list comprehension, for example, in Python. And this is similar, I guess, to the map function that you would use in a normal React application. So if you have some kind of state that's an array of data, for example, in a React app, and you want to do something with each element of that array, typically you would map over the array and render out some kind of user interface for the element, or for each element, I should say, and this is the way you can kind of do that with ReactPy. Now, what about reacting to events? That's a key part of building interactive web applications. And for example, what we're going to build up to here is the ability to add a new to-do and also to delete a to-do. Now, we can define handlers for this, very similar to React. I'm going to go back to the ReactPy documentation, and we're going to this section here on adding interactivity, and I'm going to click this here on components with state. Now, if you know React, you'll know about the useState hook. What happens here, and basically the reason why you need state, is that components often need to change what's on the screen as a result of an interaction. And basically when state changes, the user interface is re-rendered. And in ReactPy, we have this hooks module that we can use. So if we scroll down here, we can go to the section on adding state, and there's a use state hook that we can import from ReactPy, and then we can use that within our components. So I'm just going to show an example of that just now. Let's go back to VS Code, and at the top from ReactPy we can import the hooks, and inside this app component here we're going to define the state. So we're going to use hooks.useState, and what this is going to take is basically the initial value, and we're going to set that to the to-dos that we have up here. So let's cut those out of there, and we're going to paste them in the useState hook, and I'll fix the indentation. Now, the useState hook returns a tuple, as it says at the bottom here, and that tuple contains the current state and also a function that's going to update the state. And when you call that function to update the state, that's going to tell ReactPy to re-render the user interface. That's the purpose of state. So let's extract the current state. We're going to call that to-dos, and we can get the function which we're going to call set to-dos here from this hook. Now, this is the same structure as the useState hook in React. You get back the current state and a setter function that allows you to change the state and tell React that we need to re-render the user interface for that component. And we also have one small change to make in what we're returning. We're going to return the current state, which we called to-dos here. So let's now save this and make sure it's still working. And when we go back to the page, you can see we still have the to-dos listed here. Now let's start by showing how to delete a to-do from the list. So for example, let's say we want to delete a to-do when we click it on the user interface. And for this to work, we're going to need to handle the click event on this text here. Now in a larger application, you might have a button or some kind of icon that when you click the button is going to remove the particular to-do. But just to keep it simple, we're going to use a click event. So let's go back to the application. And what we're going to do in the app component is define a function that's going to be called when we actually want to remove a to-do, and that's going to be called delete_to-do. And it's going to take the title of the to-do that we want to delete, And for now, let's just pass. We're not going to fill in this implementation. So we're going to call this function essentially when the to-do is clicked. And this function is going to handle removing the to-do from the list. Now, one problem that we have here is that the actual text for the to-do is in this child component. So we have the child to-do component. This is the component that's responsible for rendering the to-do to the user interface. So this paragraph element here contains the to-do. When that is clicked, we want to then delete the to-do. So we need a way to actually call this function in the parent component when the to-do is clicked. Now what we can do very simply is pass this function down to each to-do. So let's add a new parameter here, and we're going to call that delete to-do. So we're passing this function, this callable, into the to-do component. And then if we go back down to the to-do component here, we still have this optional color parameter, but we're going to add the delete to-do callable here. So we're accepting that inside the child component as a prop. And then what we're going to do is we're going to call this function when the paragraph element for this to-do is clicked. Now, the first parameter to the paragraph are the attributes that we want to add, for example, styles, but we can also add event handlers using this. So I'm going to add an on-click event here, so on_click, and we're going to call a function here that we're going to define in a second called handleClick. So let's copy the name of this, and again, inside the to-do component, we can define functions within that component. So this one's going to be called handleClick. And all we need to do here is call the delete to-do function that's been passed down into this component. So delete to-do, and we're going to pass in the name of the to-do here. So let's pass that into the delete to-do function. So remember that for each one of the to-dos that we have on the user interface, there is one component for each one of those, and that component has that name. So we're passing that name that's passed down into the delete to-do function. And what that means is that it's going to call this function here on the app component, and then we can change the state that we have here. For example, to remove a to-do with this title. And because we want the user interface to update, we're going to call this setToDo's_setter function in order to change or mutate the state that we have here. Now, one way you might think to do this is to find the index of the title that's passed into delete to-do and just delete the element at that index. But that's actually not going to be sufficient for what we need to achieve here. And that's because with React, there's all these concerns about how to mutate the state. And I'm going to reference a page on this just now, the dangers of mutability. Now, state can hold any type of value, but you need to be careful to avoid directly modifying objects that you declare as state with ReactPy. So we don't want to mutate values that are held as state. What you should do instead is change the values by either using new ones or creating copies and mutating those. Now, some values in Python are mutable, some are immutable. Examples of mutable types are dictionaries and lists, and examples of immutable types include strings and tuples. Now, if you look at this page, you can see many examples here on how to work with different data types, for example, dictionaries. So for example, avoiding calling methods like dictionary.update or dictionary.setDefault. Better strategies are to copy the existing keys and values and then add the new keys if that's what you're doing. And similarly for removing items from a dictionary, you have strategies for that as well. So you can see what to avoid in this documentation. So here we have the case where we're adding a new key to the dictionary D. Instead, the better way to do this is to copy all of the existing keys and values and then add our new key and value like this. Now, if we go back to VS Code, we can see that what we have as state here is a Python list. So let's go back to this documentation. And when we're removing a list item when it's clicked, we're going to go to the section on working with lists. And for removing items, you have this here. Now, we shouldn't directly remove an item from the list. Instead, what we should do is get the index of the element that we want to remove. And then we can copy all of the elements up to that index, but not including that element. And then append to that all of the elements after the index. That'll essentially remove the element at the index. But we're making copies of all of the data by using this slicing notation. And again, we have the summary at the bottom. So methods that directly mutate the object, such as append and extend, we want to avoid those and instead prefer creating copies and adding new values into the copies. So that's just a quick aside, but we're going to go back to VS Code and we're going to write the body of delete to do. Now we're going to take the title that was passed into this function and we're going to find the index of the item in the to-dos with this title. So let's do that just now. We're passing title into the todos.index method. That's going to give us back an index. So let's store that in a variable here. And let's say the title is learn SQL. The index in that case would be 1. And for learn Python, the index would be 0 and so on. So we have access to the index and we can now create the new state. So we're going to take the current state, which is the to-dos, and we can get all of the elements up to the index. So for example, if we have element number 2 here, what this is going to give us is the elements up to that index and not including it. So for example, the first 2 elements here, we're going to take that, and to that we want to append any elements after the index. So let's take that index here and add 1 to it, and we can get all elements up to the end of the list using this syntax. Now what we need to do is take this list here that's going to be returned, and we need to set the new to-dos by calling this setter method. So let's finally just pass that in as a parameter to the set to-dos method, and that's going to reset the state to whatever we have here after we've removed that to-do. Now I think this is correct, so I want to save this and we're going to run python main.py, and let's test this out and make sure we have this working as expected. So I'm back on the application here, and if we click learn Python, nothing is actually happening here, and let's go back here. The problem is that the handle click method is taking 0 positional arguments, but 1 was given. So let's go down here, and the thing I've forgotten to do is when we have an event handler, we need to accept the event as a parameter. So let's try this again. I've restarted the server and we can go back to the page, and when we click learn Python, notice that it's removed from the list. And if we click the last element here, that will be removed as well up until the point where we have no elements left. And of course we can refresh the page to get back these elements. So this is now working. What's happening here, just to go through the flow, we have defined a delete to do method that's going to find the index of the to-do that was clicked, and it's going to remove that from the state by essentially copying all of the elements from the existing state but removing the element at that index, and then calling set to-dos to reset that state. And this delete to do method is passed down to the child component as a prop and accepted here within each to-do. And within each to-do we're passing an on-click handler here, and a handle click function is what's going to be called when we click the text in that paragraph, and that's going to then call the delete to do method on the parent component. So I hope that makes sense. Let's now finish the video by showing how to add to-dos. Now in order to do this, I'm going to create a new component. So let's copy the component decorator here, and we're going to define a new component, and that's going to be add to-do form, and this is going to contain a simple form. And like the to-do component, we're going to pass a callable into this child component from the root component of the application, which is the app component. So let's accept that for now. And we're going to have some state here. So we're going to have the to-do itself that's being submitted, and we'll have a setter here of set to-do as well. So we're going to use the hooks here, and we're going to call use state. Now remember, to-dos have a title. If we go up here, we're passing in the to-dos title, and that comes from these here. So the initial state for the to-do is what we're going to pass as an argument to the use state hook. And we're going to set that to an empty string, and the user's going to fill out the state using a simple input element. Now what are we going to return from the add to do form? It's going to be an html.div component, and inside that div we'll define an input element, and this is what's going to allow the user to type in some text. And we're going to pass some options to that. So first of all, we're going to have the value, and that is going to be tied to the to-do state. So the current state of to-do is going to be the value of this input. And secondly, we can pass in an onChange handler so that when the user types into the input, we can then call a method that we're going to call handleChange, and that's going to update the state here. And I'm going to fill in this method at the moment. And remember from before, we need to pass the event itself into the method, and we'll have the body of that in a second. But as well as the input element, we want to have a button that allows the user to submit. So let's add an html.button element. And again, we're going to add an on-click handler here, and we can do that with on-click. And we're going to set this to a function called handleClick. And let's give the button some text of add to do. And just like handleChange, we need to define the handleClick method. So let's just copy that, and we can update the name of the function. Now, whenever we have these event handlers, we need to pass the event in, as you can see here. And let's start with this handleChange function. This is called when the input value changes. So when the user types into the field, what we want to do is call set to do here, and we want to set it to whatever has been typed by the user. So what we're going to do in here is call set to do, and we're going to reference the event in order to get this value. And the event has a key called target, which in turn has a key called value. That's similar to the web DOM interface, if you're familiar with that. The target of the event is going to be the input element, and the value of that input is going to be whatever the user has typed. So we're passing that into set to do in order to reset the state, and the to do is then going to have whatever the user has typed. And then the second function here is handleClick. When the button is clicked, we want to call the add to do method that's been passed into the component as a prop. And we're going to pass up the to-do state that we have here on line 32. So the next step is to define the add to-do method on the parent, which is the app component here. So let's do that just now. The function's called add to-do, and it's going to take a value in here. And for now, we're just going to print that value to the terminal. Now, before we show this, the last thing to do is just to take the name of the new component, add to do form, and let's add this to the structure that we have above. And I'm going to add that in the middle, just above the list of to-dos. So let's paste this in here, and we need to pass that add to do function down into the child component. So it's this one here, that's going to be passed down into the add to do form. And then in the add to do form, we will call that when the user clicks the button with this handle click method. So let's now check this out on the user interface. And when we go here, notice we now have the input and the button here just above the list of to-dos. And if we type learn Java in there and click this button, if we go back to the application, notice that that is now printed on the terminal. And that means that the data is flowing from the child component up to the parent, which is in this method here. And that's what's responsible for printing that to the terminal. Now, instead of that, what we want to do is we want to add the new to-do to the current state. So we're going to set a new list of items. What we're going to do is copy the existing list, and we're going to add the new value. So let's do that just now in the add to do method. So we're going to call set to dos, which is the setter function that we have on the app component in order to set these. But instead of deleting one as we did before, we're going to add this new value to the to-dos. So let's pass in a new array here, and we're going to copy all of the existing values of the to-dos, and we can add the new value at the end. So let's now show this. We're going to go back here, and if we type learn JavaScript into this, notice that it appears at the end of the list. And we can add as many things as we want here. Now there's a couple of improvements we can make. For example, when we add the new to-do, we want to clear this input and reset the value to an empty string. And we might also want to prevent adding a duplicate, and that's going to show how we can use conditional statements in these components. Now let's start by showing how to clear the input box. So let's go back to VS Code, and we can do this very easily in the add to do form. So when we have clicked the button, we send the new to do to the parent component to be added, and then underneath that we can call set to do and reset that to its default value of an empty string, and that's going to handle that. So let's save this and go back to our application. And this time, if we type learn JavaScript in here and add that, it resets the value here, as you can see. Now the second thing we're going to do is prevent duplicates being added. That's a little bit more complicated, so let's go back to VS Code, and in the application here we're going to add some new state. So we already have state for these to-dos, but you can have as much state as you want in an application. So I'm going to add this state here of adding duplicate and set adding duplicate, and we can set that to false by default. Now when we call add to do here, rather than just setting the to-dos immediately, we're going to have a conditional expression check whether we're adding a duplicate. So what we can do here is check if the value is not in the to-dos, that is the current state. In that case, what we can do is we can call the function that we defined before, the set to-dos function, and that's going to reset that state here, and then we can call set adding duplicate here to set this adding duplicate state to false, because if the value is not in the to-dos, then we can safely add it because it's not a duplicate. And actually we don't need this is here, we're just checking if value is not in to-dos. Otherwise, if we hit this else block here, we know the value already exists in the to-dos. And what we can do in that case is call set adding duplicate, that's the setter here, and we're going to set that to true. But we're not going to call set to-dos here, so we're not going to update the state if we are adding a duplicate. And finally, in the HTML that's returned, what I'm going to do is render a paragraph here that says duplicate exists. But we're only going to show that paragraph if the adding duplicate state is true, otherwise we're going to render none. So that's an example of conditional rendering here. We only render the paragraph if this state is true, otherwise we're not going to show it. Now let's test this out before we finish the video. So we're back on the application here. If we try and add learn JavaScript, we do get that added and the input is cleared. If we add that back here, we are unable to add the duplicate and we get the message of duplicate exists. So that is now working fine, and we're using some state here called adding duplicate to handle the cases when we're trying to add a to-do, and if the value is not in the to-dos, we can safely add it. But if it is in to-dos, we're not going to change that state, but we are going to set the adding duplicate to true, and in that case we show that message. So that's a very simple solution, but you can see how we can build these kind of applications using ReactPy. It's not the nicest looking application, but you can integrate this with Tailwind CSS and also component frameworks like Daisy UI or Bootstrap, and you can build nice interactive applications. Now, like I said, there are a bunch of different tools for this. For example, Reflex If you're interested in any videos on this, let me know just below. And I would say at the end of the video, if you are a web developer and you know HTML and JavaScript, these tools are probably not what you're going to use. This is more useful for people like data scientists or scientific programmers that need to build small web interfaces, but they don't want to learn the complexities of the front-end ecosystem, such as React. Instead, they can build tools just using Python, which is the preferred language, and ReactPy is just one of a suite of these tools. If you have any opinions on the best one of these, let me know in the comments. And if you have any you'd like to see on this channel, or any suggestions in general, let me know in the comments as well. And finally, if you want to support the channel, check out our Ko-fi page just below the video. And I want to say thanks to everyone that has contributed to that, it's greatly appreciated. And we've also opened channel memberships as well. And I'm going to start running monthly polls for one video a month that's chosen by members. So if you want to get involved in that, you can join the channel just below the video. Thanks again for watching, guys, and we'll see you in the next video.